Hello. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first ever Fall Freedom Festival here in Wyoming. It's a lovely day today. I think we can all see that. What brought us here together today is the plain and simple fact that through it all, no matter what divides us, no matter what adversities we face, we hold steadfast to the belief that freedom is our founding principle. It unites us, it sustains us, it fortifies us, and it is what we will never let go of, no matter what. So, without further eloquence, I'd like to start things off with a poetry reading from The Hill That We Climb. If you could come up and introduce yourself, please.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me, everybody? Okay. This is a poem by Amanda Gorman. She read it on the occasion of the 2021 inaugural for the presidency. And I should mention that I will read it as it's written and as it was voiced at that time. So you will probably notice that I am not a skinny black girl of 22. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl, descended from slaves and raised by a single mother, can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine. But this doesn't mean we're striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose. To compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first. We must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so that we can reach our arms out to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true, that even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious. Not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised blade. the hill we climb, if only we dare it. Because being American is more than pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy, and this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can periodically be delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith, we trust. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eye on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So while once we asked, how can we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised, buckled, benevolent, but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and our inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. One thing is certain, if we urge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from our ground's pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will raise from the gold-limbed hills of the west. We will rise from the windswept northeast where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known rook of our nation, in every corner of our country. Our people devise, diverse, and beautiful, will emerge battered but beautiful. When day comes, we'll step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, and there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it.
Well spoken. Thank you. Now we're going to hear from a series of speakers today. So the first one is Mr. Roger McDaniel. Roger McDaniel was a Wyoming state legislator from 1971 to 1981. He received a law degree from the University of Wyoming in 1980. After practicing law for 20 years, he received a Master of Divinity degree from the Iliff School of Theology in Denver and was ordained in 1999. He was a 2000 fellow at the College of Preachers, National Cathedral, Washington, D.C., where he studied what it means for Christians to worship God on land stolen from indigenous peoples. He was director of the Wyoming Department of Family Services and headed the state's mental health and substance abuse programs from 2003 to 2011. In October 2023, he retired after serving for 15 years as pastor at Highlands United Presbyterian Church here in Cheyenne. Roger has written 5 books, most recently Profiles in Courage, Standing Against Wyoming Wind, 13 stories of marginalized people or their advocates who stood against the prevailing culture. He and his wife Patricia live in Laramie, Wyoming. They have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Come on up here, Roger.
Thank you all for being here today. I didn't know the fire department would participate. Glad to see you all here. As I begin, I want to acknowledge Joe Ramirez invited me to come today as a storyteller. And I want to start to tell the story of Wyoming by calling your attention to the seal that is a part of the sidewalk here. You might note that at the top it says equal rights. And down the side it mentions only farmers, ranchers, the oil and gas and mining industry. Doesn't say anything about equal rights for working people, people of color, men, women, and children, the sort of people who built this state. And that's really been the story of Wyoming. On the ballot this year, there are 2 candidates for the legislature who were at the Capitol protesting what they called a stolen election on January 6th. One of them has a wife who is leading the effort to ban books at Laramie County School District number 1. The head of the Republican Party in Wyoming is a member of the Oath Keepers. And if you're like me, you've spent a lot of time the last few years saying things like, I don't get it. But I do get it when I look at the history of this state. It all starts in 1868 when the territorial legislature gives women the right to vote. And the next year they tried to repeal it. And they fell just 1 vote short in the legislature of getting that done. Next in the history of Wyoming is the Rock Springs Massacre, when at least 24 Chinese immigrants were killed when Union Pacific Railroad pitted them against white workers in a union dispute. Then in 1890, we have the Constitutional Convention. It's time for the new state to write its constitution. And if you go back and you read the record of the Constitutional Convention, you'll find that one of the longest debates they had was over the question of whether or not to continue to allow women to vote. And ultimately, on a very narrow decision, they decided to continue that. And then the debate went on to, what are we going to do with these black slaves who are coming to Wyoming after the Civil War? Do we let them vote? And ultimately, they decided that they could vote, but there would be a literacy test because, quote, we don't want them ruining the state of Wyoming the way they ruined the South after the Civil War. And that literacy test stayed in the Wyoming Constitution until 1965, when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and made such limitations on the right to vote illegal. Then we get into the 20th century and into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, when the Ku Klux Klan had a significant presence in Wyoming, in at least 20 different communities, not just the big ones like Casper, in Cheyenne, but Grable and Riverton and Rock Springs and a lot of the smaller communities where the Klan was very active and a major political force for 2 decades, which led to lynchings in Wyoming, a history that you may not have read in your high school or college Wyoming history books. But Todd Gunther is a historian at the University of Wyoming, and he documents that during that period of time, on a per capita basis, more black men were lynched in Wyoming than in Mississippi. And if you go back in the history, look through the archives of newspapers, you'll find newspapers from Cheyenne to Laramie to Rock Springs and Casper with front page photographs of black men hanging from lampposts throughout Wyoming. And then we get to the Great Depression, where Wyoming becomes one of the last states to accept federal help to make life easier for hungry families and children in this state. Reminds me of Medicaid expansion, where the legislators really don't care about whether working families have the health care that they need. So the Great Depression then gives way to World War II and Heart Mountain. If you go to the University of Wyoming American Heritage Center and look through the files of people like Governor Lester Hunt, you'll find this incredible racism about the Japanese Americans. These were American citizens who were being incarcerated at Heart Mountain. And Nell Smith, who was then the governor of Wyoming, said to Franklin Roosevelt and to his person who was heading up the relocation camps, if you bring those Japs to Wyoming, there'll be one hanging from every tree in this state. That was Wyoming in World War II. That gave way to McCarthyism in the post-World War II era. Joe McCarthy was so popular here that he came to campaign against the Democratic incumbent Joe Monty, campaigned in Riverton, and had the biggest political rally in the history of this state. Perhaps as many as 15 to 18,000 people gathered to hear Joe McCarthy talk about how the Democrats were communists. And they defeated Joe O'Mani that year based on McCarthy's support. You may know the history of McCarthy's role then in bringing about the suicide of Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt when his son was arrested for soliciting homosexual sex at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. And Republicans like McCarthy and others seized on that as an opportunity to force Lester Hunt out of the Senate because the Democrats controlled the Senate by 1 vote. And if they could force Hunt out of the Senate, the Republican governor in Wyoming would replace him with a Republican, and the Republicans would control the U.S. Senate. And for a year, they tortured this man and his family. And in June of 1954, he'd had enough and he took his own life. And McCarthyism then gives way, the mid-50s, McCarthyism gives way to the 60s and the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society had as many members as the top 10 membership states across the country here in Wyoming. The John Birch Society was a huge player in electing school board members. And their theory, written in their strategy books, is don't worry about who's in Congress, don't worry about who the governor is, worry about who's on the school board. Because if we control the school boards, we'll control how our children learn and what they learn. Do you see any of that repeated today? Right here in Laramie County, where the school board election is probably the most important election that we have coming in November. After the John Birch Society, we have this sort of lull in Wyoming history, kind of a lull in far-right activity from the mid-60s into the 1980s, when Wyoming elected people like Dale McGee and Tina Recalio and Ed Hirschler and Mike Sullivan and others. When the legislature in 1976 was my last term in the state house, the Senate was a tie, 15-15. And in the House, the Democrats were 2 votes short of a majority. That all began to change in 1991 when the federal court ruled that Wyoming had to adopt single-member districts. Before that, we ran at large. In Laramie County, there were 11 legislators. We all ran at large. We all had to represent South Cheyenne, North Cheyenne, Pine Bluffs, Burns, the entire county. Then when they went to single-member districts, it institutionalized not only a Republican majority, but it institutionalized a far-right Republican majority that we see today. It's single-member districts that are responsible for the rabid right-wing bomb throwers that control the legislature from the Freedom Caucus today. Then in 1998, we have the murder of Matthew Shepard. As recent as this week, I encountered a well-educated man in Laramie who said to me, you know, Matthew's homosexuality had nothing to do with his murder. He was murdered because he was selling meth. And that's how they try to erase that history and justify the fact that now, in spite of Matthew Shepard's murder, Wyoming is one of only 4 states in the country that has failed to enact a hate crimes law. So that's the history that brings us to where we are today. That's why the Freedom Caucus is running the legislature. That is why the legislature finds itself in a position to continue to take away your freedoms. Your freedom to choose health care for yourself and your family, your freedom to decide what books your children read, the academic freedom of the University of Wyoming, which is now under the management of the Freedom Caucus. And so it is that we find ourselves at this election thanking God Wyoming only has 3 electoral votes, because 75% of the state in November will support a felon, the most corrupt president in the history of the country. But the entire story hasn't been written. We have an opportunity to figure out how this story ends. This is a small gathering here today. We wish it was many times this size, because there are many more people in Wyoming who agree with you, who are concerned about the direction of the state and are concerned about losing their freedoms. So it's going to be up to a small group of people to talk to them, to get them out to vote, to get them registered. You know that in Wyoming now, it's the primary election that decides who is elected to the legislature. The decisions are already made by the time we get to the general election. The decisions are made in Republican primaries. Do you know how many people voted in this last primary in August to give control of the legislature to the Freedom Caucus? 27% of the eligible voters in Wyoming went to the polls. 27%. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of reason to do it. As Connor mentioned, I have 5 grandchildren. Many of you have grandchildren. What kind of state will we give to them unless we do something about the story that is being told in Wyoming history? To turn it around and to change it so that the seal, when the seal says equal rights, it's talking about us and our children more so than it's talking about the oil and gas industry and the ranchers and the farmers. So God bless you. We've got a lot of work to do. Let's finish this story the way it ought to be told.
Thank you. Thank you. Roger, we got time for questions. Anybody's got questions for Roger?
What do you think the best way for people to start getting out and speaking, showing that not being afraid, where they're actually going to be heard?
The question is, what is the best way for people to be heard? Well, they have to speak. I mean, if people are afraid, then they won't be heard. You know, people have to write letters to the editor. People have to come out to events like this. They have to run for office. The most important thing they do is fundamentally basic to a democratic republic. They have to vote. half of the registered voters, half of the eligible voters in Wyoming are not registered. And only half of the registered voters voted in August. And I'll tell you where that's important. The last time Wyoming elected a Democrat to Congress was 1976. In 1976, 80% of the eligible voters were registered, and the turnout was in the 90% range. So, you know, there were candidates like Gail McGee and Tino Roncalio and Ed Herschler who spent a great deal of their time and resources just getting people registered. Today, half of the eligible voters are not registered, and I've got to guess that those are people who have given up on the system because the system gave up on them. So we've got some real hard grassroots work to do to get them registered and get them out to vote. But find ways to speak, find ways to have your voices heard in the clubs. When you're having lunch with somebody and they give you that nonsense about Trump or LGBTQ people or whatever it is, call them out on it. Let your friends know that you're not the only one who thinks that way. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Roger. So next, we have JaQuale Brooks-Richardson, born and raised here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where she was a graduate from Central High School and went on to complete her bachelor's degree in criminal justice at the University of Wyoming. After completion of her degree, she worked for some time with juveniles before shifting working with adults as a probation and parole agent for the Wyoming Department of Corrections. In 2016, JaQuale moved to Colorado Springs to work as a probation officer in Denver and later in Colorado Springs. An opportunity came for JaQuale to take her experience and skills to work as the program administrator for the county jail in Denver, Colorado. This work allowed her to run the programs in the jail to include the substance abuse programming, parenting programming, GED, cognitive behavioral programming, religious programming, and so much more, while supervising the program staff and training and working with the 500 plus volunteers working within the jail. This work also allowed for JaQuale to be a part of bigger conversations with the city council members and other government officials and work towards building bridges and closing gaps in services for the incarcerated population with the guidance of the program director. In 2021, JaQuale shifted from the work in the jail to working for human services in a capacity where she is still able to help others while also ensuring that government benefits are being handled appropriately. Also, in 2021, JaQuale became a licensed minister and has taken that call very seriously. She strives to have her ministry, life, and career line up with the Word of God and His will. JaQuale carries her relationship with God in every area of her life because she knows that she would not be where she is without Him. JaQuale loves the place in life she is in with her husband, Devon Richardson, and two daughters, Jakira and Jakaya, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So JaQuale, come on up.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Trying to figure out which one should I be in. I guess this one. Can you hear me well? Get right into it. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So as he's already mentioned, my name is JaQuale Brooks-Richardson, and I'm from Cheyenne, Wyoming, a graduate of Central High School. Yay. And I'm coming here, and it says he has it titled as a storyteller. And so I'm just coming to give you a little brief story. And it says it's question and answer at the end of this, so you can ask me any questions that you have. But I'm just going to speak to you a little bit about the story that I have as far as being raised in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and coming from this place, and what freedom means to me and how I'm connected to that word. And so as a young child being raised in Cheyenne, Wyoming, as you can tell, like, I'm African American. So what that looks like for me, going to school in Cole Elementary, Johnson Junior High, and Central High School, sometimes I might be the only one that looks like me in my class. But you know what? That's okay, because there's a freedom in that, and understanding that the education that I'm allowed to receive gives me an opportunity, right? That then if I take heed to that and I do what's necessary with it, it gives me an opportunity then to do what it is and to fulfill purpose. And so recognizing that I have freedom in education was something that I learned very early on, in part because my family is very educated oriented. My grandmother, who used to be a teacher in Laramie County School District number 1, who is no longer here, Maddie Douglas Brooks, was an educator. And so when you get raised in a family where you have educators being present and forthright in your family, what that means is that you have to make a decision on whether or not you're going to take that freedom of education, or you're going to leave it where it is. And so for me, I decided I'm going to take that freedom of education and I'm going to do something with it. There's many more educators that come behind Maddie Douglas Brooks. There's also Karen Rochelle Brooks Lyons, who is a principal at Henderson Elementary School, and she just so happens to be my aunt. It was my 5th grade teacher, right? And then you have my cousin Danielle, who me and her are ride or die, as they call it, who's also a counselor at Cary Junior High right now as we speak, because as I told you, education is big in the world that we come from. And so grasping the freedom of education, listen, is something that mattered very much to me, because I recognized what it was going to do for me and how it was going to allow for me to move. You know, there's also an opportunity to recognize that you have a freedom to grow, right? And so we can choose to stay where we are, or we can choose to accept the fact that growth is a possibility in all of our lives, depending on how we choose to move and what we choose to accept. And so the freedom of growth is something that has mattered to me just the same, because I don't want to be where I was when I was in 5th grade, and I don't want to be where I was in 10th grade or graduating from college. But as now a parent and somebody who is in my professional career, I want to be able to say that who I was before is not who I am now, because I chose to use the freedom of growth and opportunity. Okay, and so when we talk about freedom, there's a lot of different aspects that we can speak to, because we've been given an opportunity to be free in a lot of places in our lives. And like, freedom doesn't have a respect of person. Freedom is just something that you can choose to accept or not to accept. And so there's also that piece of freedom of religion. And see, you heard in my bio that, like, I have become a licensed minister. So sometimes when I get to talking, that shows forth a little bit every now and then. But the freedom of religion and the freedom of the ability to have the spirituality that you choose to have, and to have a relationship with God, and then choose to move in that manner, then also connects to that freedom of growth, right? Because when you have a connection with God and the opportunity to grow in Him and have relationship with Him, then you don't get to stay the same. So then now that freedom of religion, the freedom of spirituality and growth and connection to God, then lends for you to be able to move differently than you were moving before. Right? And so I have to thank God for that, because the freedom of religion then allowed for me then to learn at an early age as well, that not only can I be educated, not only can I choose to grow, but I can also choose to move in a way that is approved, you know, by the way of God, who I know continues to save my life on a daily basis. Right? And so all of these freedoms lead up to the person that you see standing here today. It's not by accident, you know, that I'm able to stand here and that somebody says, well, JaQuale, would you mind coming and speaking for a Freedom Festival? Because we've heard that you have, you know, this story to tell and this life experiences that have gotten to where you are. And that is very true, but that's because of all the freedoms that have been afforded. And so while in Wyoming, this little black girl who grew up in Wyoming, you know, has all of these different stories and all of these different connections. And there's some negative and there's a lot of positive that I could speak to, but all of it has shaped who I am and the person that gets to stand here and speak in front of you today. And so the understanding that I want to just give is in the relation to freedom is that we can speak about a lot of things that are going on in the world right now. We can speak about the things that we don't understand and why things are so, jacked up, as you might call it, or messed up in our eyes. But what you have to understand is this, is that we have a freedom to choose which direction we want to go with this. And so while one person might want to choose the negative side of this, you have the freedom to choose the freedom to choose to be positive. While one side might want to choose to talk or to slander, you have the freedom to choose to speak the good words and to speak the kind words. You have the freedom to be the example that you want to set for other people. See, so when we talk about freedom, it doesn't just mean that like that people can march and that people can have a freedom of speech and the freedom to bear arms and all of those things. Those exist. That is very true. But it also means that you have a freedom of choice. Right? And so that freedom of choice, even when you're talking about a relationship with God, see, here I go, that minister's license is coming out. When you talk about that relationship with God, God also gives you a freedom of choice, right? And so in this world, we have the freedom to choose to do the right thing, or the freedom to choose to do the wrong thing, or the freedom to be the example and set that for those who are coming up behind us, and even for those who have come before us, because sometimes we might get off track. Sometimes those who might have come before us, they might have thought something, or they assumed something to be a certain way, and it worked for a time. But there's times where things have to change and we have to do something different. And it's okay to choose to do something different. And you have the freedom to do it. And so what I have been employed to come here and speak to you today is just on those pieces of like making sure that in this space that we don't misuse the freedom that we've been given, but that we accept the freedom that we've been given, and that we choose to use it appropriately and in a way that pushes a positive agenda and not one that is going to hurt, harm, or cause any kind of issue to anybody. And we get to choose that. And so that's what I want to push here today. Like I'm just here to tell you, positivity is key. When you're able to be that good example to somebody else, like you never know who's watching you and who's paying attention to you. And so when you make the choice to be free, to be the positive example and to do the right thing and to say the right thing, even in the midst of somebody maybe not doing that in front of you, when you make that choice though, what you've done now is it's a trickle effect. And it's a domino effect, because once somebody's experienced that positive freedom from you, now they know that it's possible to do the same thing. And then once they've experienced it from somebody else, it gets to trickle down to the next person, and that domino hits somebody else, and they get the freedom to choose to do the right thing. And so I'm just here to employ you to be the positive in the world, be the kind, and use your freedom of choice, right? To do those types of things that will be the example that somebody can speak to and say and connect to your name, that this person, I saw this from this person and it changed my life. I felt this from this person and it changed my life. And so because of that, I decided to change the trajectory of the way I was talking, the way I was walking, and the way that I was moving. And so when we're talking about freedom, don't miss that freedom is always a choice to decide which direction that you want to move, and move in it when it's the right direction. And even if we make a mistake one time, make the choice. Have the freedom of choice then to say, I made a mistake, but I'm going to move differently now because I want to make sure that I touch somebody in the right way. I want to make sure that when my name is connected to something, that it's connected to something that is positive, and that it is pushing forward a positive agenda and the kindness of the world that is expected. We can't assume to make people be kind if we're not showing them what kindness looks like. You have to recognize that when we decide to talk about people, and we decide to talk about issues, and we decide to talk about struggles and talk about things, when we talk about stuff, we can't treat anybody or any situation better than we talk about it. So if you're going to talk negatively about a situation or negatively about a person, then recognize that when it comes time for you to treat or deal with them in a way, that's all going to be pushed forward. So you have to make sure that in your conversation, that there's kindness. In your speaking to other people, that there's positivity. Because the legacy that we want to leave is that our freedom of choice lended to us talking about people and talking about situations in a positive way. So then that way when we're acting on it, that they match. That what we speak and what we act, that they match. And so I'm just here to tell you that this girl that grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and that dealt with many different things, that I'm okay with because I know that it shaped who I am today. It was a decision in making a choice to be free in all of the spaces that we're going to allow for a positive outcome and allow for kindness to be connected to my name, and it was going to allow for education and example to be set for other people that came before me and then after me. And so please, as we leave from this place of the Freedom Fall Festival, that we recognize that freedom costs a little bit. It costs a little sacrifice, but that it's worth it, right? If we choose to use it appropriately and do the right things with it. And so I don't know if I met my 15 minutes, but I don't want to keep talking just for the sake of talking. But if anybody has any questions or any comments or anything that they want to lend to me, by all means you can. But I'll just leave you with this. Don't talk about a situation and act differently about it. You can't do or treat any situation or person better than you talk about it. So if we put kind words and put positive words in our mouth, it then lends for an opportunity for that freedom of choice to shine through in a positive way.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, young lady.
Anybody have any questions?
I have 2 tambourines if anybody wants to play one. Anybody like protest songs? How many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man? The answer, my friend, is blown in the wind. The answer is blown in the wind. A little taste of Bob Dylan for you about some heat of destruction. The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has bodies floating, and you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. All the hate there is in Red China, then take just one look down at Selma, Alabama. You may leave here for 4 days in space, but when you return, it's the same old place. The pound of the drums, the pride and disgrace. Hate your next door neighbor, but don't forget to say grace, and you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. So I've been playing up at the farmer's market again this year after a couple of years hiatus. I had a hip replacement, and now I'm feeling much better. I see a bunch of people out there that I know, so hello, how do you do? Inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow. All it takes is a rake and a hoe and a piece of fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, someone bless these seeds I sow. Someone warm them from below till the rain comes tumbling down. Plant your rows straight and long, temper them with prayer and song. Mother Earth will make us strong if you give her love and care. Crow watching hungrily from his perch in yonder tree. I'm as happy as can be as that feathered peak up there. So here's a new one I'm working on. It's about paying attention to what's going on all around you. Is everybody paying attention? Not letting the world get by on you, are you? I keep my eye on the marquee. 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 Everybody got that? So let's sing it together, because we gotta pay attention. I keep my eye on the marquee. I keep my eye on the marquee. I keep my eye on the marquee. Keep my eye on the marquee. Keep my eye on the marquee. I leave my options open. 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 I keep my eye on the marquee, and I leave my options open. I'm paying attention to what's going on. I'm paying attention to what's going on all around me. All around me, all around you, too. Are you paying attention? Everybody now, I keep my eye on the marquee. I keep my options open. I keep my eye on the marquee. I keep my options open. I'm paying attention to what's going on around me. Keep paying attention. That's it. Thank you very much. Glad to be here to share some music with you guys.
Thank you, Earl.
Thanks, Earl.
Thanks, Connor. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. So, now we're going to hear from Alan Owashi. Alan Washi is an author and documentary filmmaker now living in Boulder, Colorado by way of Cheyenne, Laramie, and Gillette. He is a Cheyenne native, having attended Fairview Elementary, Cary Junior High, and East High School. Alan wrote a memoir and produced a PBS documentary entitled Beyond Heart Mountain about the overt and subtle racism he, his family, and other Japanese in Cheyenne experienced during and after World War II. The once vibrant Japanese neighborhood on the 400 and 500 blocks of West 17th Street is his story's backdrop. Alan, it's great to see you.
Well, thanks for Joe and Connor for asking me to give a few words. As I mentioned, I'm a storyteller, and I wrote this book called Beyond Heart Mountain. That I have some available if you wanted to pick one up, but apparently we can't do any kind of commercial enterprising around here. But I always thought commerce was protected free speech, but apparently not. But for the state of Wyoming, and I rewrote that in this story that's called "Views from Beyond Metropolis," and the subtitle is "Reimagine the American Way and Learn How to Bridge Multicultural Divides in an Ever-Changing World." And what struck me is I heard a statistic that by 2045, the United States of America is going to be a majority-minority country, meaning that there will be no single group of people who will be in a majority position. And, I heard part of Roger's comments about, sort of the divisive nature of politics these days. And part of the reason for that divisiveness is there are factions of the dominant culture who are afraid of losing that identity. And as opposed to trying to move forward with that, the idea is to try to move backwards while the rest of the world is moving forward. And I don't know, one thing that I hear when I talk to people about my books, or just run into people who have just asked questions about this idea of the Japanese internment in northwest Wyoming, is I never knew about that. I never knew there was a Japanese camp in Wyoming. How come we didn't learn about that in school? Well, it's just part of the, sort of the central nature of perpetuating the dominant culture story. And I suppose there's not really anything wrong with that, because at the time, the United States was dominated by predominantly one culture. But as we all know, there have been many cultures that have occupied the United States, including the native indigenous cultures, as well as people who were brought against their will and enslaved to drive the growing economy during colonial times. But we were talking about, I can't remember who was speaking ahead of me, but there's this notion of freedom. But it's freedom for if you are actually free. And people were, going back to the Japanese experience, that was legalized oppression based on this whole notion about how the country was originally founded back in the 16th century, when the first people were brought over from West Africa to be enslaved in Spanish colonies. It wasn't just the Western Europeans. And so for about 400 years, going on 500, I guess it's 600 years by now, going on 600 years, there's been legalized oppression in the United States. And so our challenge is, how do we undo that oppression, particularly since it was legalized. And so you all know about the Emancipation Proclamation and about Juneteenth. And Lincoln issued his emancipation to sort of undo or to repeal the laws of the Confederate States of America. In their Constitution, slavery was legalized. And so it was a matter of President Lincoln, after the war was over, trying to undo that law. But nonetheless, the laws of oppression remained on the books, including Executive Order 9066 that was issued by Franklin Roosevelt after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Because in February of 1942, he issued his executive order, which basically legalized the rounding up of 120,000 Japanese from mostly on the West Coast and incarcerating them in 10 relocation camps located in the interior of the United States. And one question that I get is, well, did your family live at Heart Mountain, or did your family live in any of the internment camps around the country? And the answer is no, because families in places like Wyoming and Colorado and Montana were viewed as being already interned or already imprisoned in place. Like we were not necessarily a tactical or strategic threat against the United States. Although Fort Warren was here in Cheyenne, and my parents and other Japanese in town had to, if they wanted to travel 5 to 20 miles away out of town, they had to file for a transit visa to go to Denver, for example. And they had to report to the authorities once they got to where they were heading. And then once they headed back, they had to report back to law enforcement, that being the sheriff or the city police or the U.S. Attorney's Office, to let them know that they had made their rounds. So freedom is relative, and we all think we have it, and we all do have it, but it's still under the auspices of how the society was set up, which is under the sort of Anglo-Saxon rule. I'm just kind of rambling on my story, but it doesn't surprise me because we had religious zealots come from England with their guns and Bibles and founded the United States of America. And so it really doesn't surprise me that with the white nationalism movement, and it doesn't really surprise me about the gun rights movement, because that's how the country was founded. And there really hasn't been much pushback towards that over the years. And if hundreds of kids getting shot at school doesn't cause gun violence to be changed, I don't know if anything is going to make that happen. And so that's why I think it's up to us as individuals to not necessarily rant and chant and wave and yell about particular issues, and then once the photo ops are over with and the street sweepers pick up all the signs, what happened next? Well, we usually just go back to our homes, go back to our jobs, go back to our daily lives, and wait for the next freedom festival to happen. But I think what's important is that for all of us we hear something that resonates with us, hear something that's news, hear something that's good for positive change. What can we do? Well, talk to somebody, talk to allies, as opposed to going to and following the crowd to a rally or some kind of protest event, because those ultimately don't really do anything. There are what they say, there are over the years of the Women's March, there are 100,000 people that took to the streets. I came to the Cheyenne March. There were probably 10,000 people in Cheyenne on that December 17th, 2021, or 2017. And where are they now? We have 30 people who showed up to this thing. How do we get people to continue to keep the messages alive and continue to keep purporting this message of freedom and equality and equal justice? Well, it takes each of us to continue to talk to one another, continue to build quiet movements among ourselves, as opposed to being against something that we don't agree with. We all agree amongst ourselves, or we wouldn't be here. So I think it's important for us to work with one another and create more of a quiet movement one person plus one. Those two people talk to two people, that turns into four. Those four people talk to somebody, it turns into 8. And so what if we had ourselves plus one as the theme of the the Fall Freedom Festival? But you know what? It shouldn't be in the fall. This should be a festival that happens every day. It should be something that we wake up and talk about when we wake up in the morning, even before we turn on Wyoming Public Radio. We should be talking to our loved ones, be making a post on Facebook, seeing what our friends are up to, and not necessarily trying to write something counter to the GOP 2.0 friends that we all have, but ignoring those comments and writing something positive, finding out something good about things going on in our lives today. Well, I guess I was going to talk a little bit about this neighborhood over here. People don't even know there was a Japanese neighborhood that existed on the 400 and 500 blocks on West 17th Street, generally between O'Neill and Cary Avenue. And you remember where the old Salvation Army used to be on the corner of Cary and 17th? Started there. Across the street, there's Seidel's Automotive, which is one of the long-standing businesses on West 17th Street. It's still there. Wall's Bicycle Shop was another one of the anchor businesses in that community that were owned by white guys, and they're still and were also the anchors. They were able to get along in the neighborhood. There was the neighborhood was anchored by the City Cafe on one side of the street that was owned by a woman named Mrs. Shuto. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have gone to the City Cafe, but my grandmother worked there. And my grandmother got her start working for Mrs. Shuto at the City Cafe. And after the war, she and my grandfather and Uncle George started the Highway Cafe on the South Greeley Highway. And I don't know how many of you remember that place, but it's now a pink painted building that's turned into a donut shop. I went in there not the other day, but the first time that she opened, and went in and she gave me a tour of the inside. Still kind of the same layout. I remember she was cooking with oil, and so I recognized the smell of grease. And so my family, I have two cousins here, Leslie and Ellison O'Hashy, my Uncle Jake's daughters. Uncle Jake used to own Pioneer Printing, which is now went out of business after many years, and is now I think it's a craft brewery. But our family had a strong presence in downtown Cheyenne. My grandfather's house was on the 700 block of West 19th Street. And so the only reason that was sort of brought back to life is because of my high school classmates, Jim and John Deneen. I saw on the TV news back 2020, 2021, they were going to build a housing subdivision. They had wanted to tear down 509 West 17th Street, which is the last building standing in the Japanese neighborhood. And the city of Cheyenne, the Historic Preservation Board, had a hearing, and one of the conditions of them being able to raise that building was to do a survey of the Japanese neighborhood. And John and Jim enlisted me to do that little project that was the basis for this book, the Beyond Heart Mountain book, and the PBS documentary that aired in 2021. And so it's now called the Lotus Apartments, and it's 20 townhouses occupied by new people in the downtown Cheyenne area trying to revitalize downtown Cheyenne. What if we were to do that in other parts of downtown? Downtown Cheyenne actually extends over the viaduct and to maybe 6th Street down there. And so downtown ought to be trying to save the stories, learn the stories of the Latin neighborhoods that are on the south side, and try to rekindle those stories. There was a big Jewish community that used to occupy downtown. We need to retell those stories and rejuvenate downtown by not only rebuilding, but also retelling the historic placemaking of downtown Cheyenne. So, thank you, and tell your stories. Ernest Hemingway said, who happened to be married at the at the UP Depot in the 1940s, Hemingway said, tell one true story, write one true sentence, and be sure that it's the true sentence that's true to your heart. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Thank you very much, Alan. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Jason Bloomberg. Dr. Jason Bloomberg is a lay leader at Mount Sinai Congregation, Wyoming's oldest and largest synagogue. For more than 30 years, he has served Jewish communities as a cantorial soloist. He and his family moved to Cheyenne in 2001 so that he could pursue his postgraduate medical training for his specialty of family medicine. Dr. Bloomberg is also a family medicine fellow in obstetrics. Prior to becoming a physician, he worked ambulance, mostly as a paramedic, for 20 years and was a firefighter for 10 years. He has served the people of Wyoming as a physician for over 20 years. Dr. Bloomberg volunteered at the Cheyenne Free Clinic for many years, and when it closed, he opened his own clinic for people who are uninsured or underinsured. There, he took care of people on sliding scale free basis, sometimes for less than the price of a pack of cigarettes, because, as he put it, either you see healthcare as a basic human right or merely a commodity for trade, and my religious traditions hold it is the former, not the latter. He operated that clinic at his own expense, out of pocket, until his patients were able to find other options after the Affordable Care Act was passed. He presently works as an overnight hospitalist at the local Veterans Administration Hospital. He has repeatedly testified to legislative committees regarding issues of health care and supports Medicaid expansion. He wants to make clear any options he expresses are his own and not that of his employer or the synagogue where he serves. He is speaking solely as an individual. Dr. Bloomberg participates in a group called Constitution Cafe, which studies and discusses Constitution Cafe, which studies and discusses U.S. history as it pertains to issues today. He also, for over 13 years, has participated in and now facilitates Bibles and Beer, an interfaith group which studies and discusses biblical texts. For 20 years, he has been a member and supporter of the Cheyenne Interfaith Council. Dr. Bloomberg has been a civil rights activist for about 60 years. He marched in support of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and against multiple wars. For over 50 years, he has been a strong supporter of a free and independent Palestine, alongside a free and independent state of Israel. He has relatives on both sides of the current conflict. He helped establish a fire and ambulance service in Ogallala on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the 1980s, serving as a volunteer for a decade, which saved many lives and homes. In Wyoming, he has been active with the Democratic Party and was twice selected to be a national delegate to the Democratic National Convention for Hillary Clinton in 2008 and again in 2016. He is an advocate for residential renewable energy, net metering, and electric vehicles. He has testified before legislative committees regarding these environmental issues. He and his wife keep to a vegetarian diet. He calls this the strictest kosher. Despite his leaning center-left politically, he points out, I have many friends whose political, religious, and dietary views are 180 degrees opposite my own. If I didn't, I'd have far fewer friends. We cherish each other in part because of our differences, our freedom to disagree, even vehemently, without being harmed or even harassed, is an important measure of the health of our Western liberal democracy as expressed by the highest ideals and aspirations of our nation's founding documents. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Connor. I realize that was long. I was asked to speak as a Jew on the issues of freedom and democracy. And I hadn't thought of this in this particular context, but given the nature of the program as I understood it, it makes sense. You know my biases from the introduction, or at least some of them. It's a difficult thing to understand others as we understand ourselves. We all tend to superimpose our own translations of what people say and create our own context of how we perceive those who are different from ourselves by imagining them in a way that's familiar to ourselves. In doing this, we assimilate them to become more comfortable for us, even when it obscures their genuine perspectives. As an American Jew, I encounter this with some frequency. Most people think they understand me and my community from what they know through the Christian tradition, through the lens of their own orientations. The classic example is the assumption someone raised in a Christian tradition who knows only about Jews through their own sacred text and media consumption. This also happens with some frequency among Muslims. Secularists and atheists with their own agendas equally struggle with their constrained perceptions of us. Many Jews do the same regarding each of those other groups I mentioned, although when one is a minority in the midst of an empowered majority, one tends to do a little extra learning beyond one's own cultural, ethnic, and religious fishbowl as a matter of survival. As a Jew in the United States, I contend with the projected symbolism of what it means to be the individual or the group I'm interacting with at any given moment. It is part of the nature of being perpetually other. Most people do not know what the English word Jew even means. In the biblical story, if you prefer, the mythology of our origins, there was a man named Jacob who had two wives. They were sisters. The younger one he loved, the older one he was tricked into marrying after her father insisted that because she was oldest, she'd be married first. In those days, infant and maternal mortality was high and life was comparatively short. If you lived to 30, you were functionally an elder. Children were your social security, so to speak, and sons carried forward your name beyond your own life. Ultimately, when Leah, the older sister, gave birth to an additional son compared to her younger sister, Leah, that child was named Yehuda, which means, I will give thanks to God. Eventually, all of the sons of Jacob, whose name had changed to Israel, one who wrestles with God is what Israel actually means, after Israel wrestled with the angel of God, became tribal headmen. This became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Eventually, we would leave and return to our ancestral land, and part of it became known as the land of Judah. And the people within it, we were called Judeans, or Yehudim, which through some linguistic conventions became the word Jews. While pronunciations have changed over time in geography, the meaning didn't. Our name means gratitude to God. Maybe someday we will have the freedom which has others being aware of this rather than misapplying our name as a slur for cheating. About 4,000 years ago, my ancestors were wandering Arameans who were refugees that sought shelter from famine in a place called Mitzrayim, a place that means the place of constriction or the land of constriction, what people geographically now call Egypt. Despite saving that land from famine, within a generation we were enslaved for 400 years. For us, freedom was being able to worship our Creator freely and return to our land from whence we came. The story of the Exodus from the land of constriction was the largest slave revolt in human history, and it has been a generational challenge to maintain freedoms ever since. That story has inspired many others in many other places. We commemorate those events with Passover, where part of what we read is a list of some of the freedoms we aspire to. Let all human families sit together at your table and drink the wine of deliverance, eat the bread of freedom. Freedom from bondage and freedom from oppression, freedom from hunger and freedom from want, freedom from hatred and freedom from fear, freedom to think and freedom to speak, freedom to teach and freedom to learn, freedom to love and freedom to share, freedom to hope and freedom to rejoice. This, by no means, is an exhaustive list of freedoms. There are other freedoms, or lack thereof, for us to consider today. One of the most basic freedoms is the freedom to be different. The ancient Babylonians said we could not be free in our own land. The Hellenized Syrians said we could be in our own land, but only if we sacrificed to Greek gods. The Romans said we could live in our own land as an occupied people and paid a tax for the privilege of worshiping in our own manner until we fought for our re-independence. When we lost, our cities were emptied, but those living in rural areas were not scattered. Christendom said we could live among them, but only as pariah foreigners, landless, ghettoized, and for 2,000 years charged with deicide. In a typical cycle of 200 years, we faced expulsions, pogroms, not unlike what happened October 7th of last year. Islam, when it arose, said we could live with special taxes as second-class non-citizen status, with pogroms and expulsions occurring typically in 400-year cycles. Amidst the Crusades, every Jewish community in the path of the Crusaders was raped, pillaged, and murdered. During the period of the Spanish Inquisition, 1/3 of Jews were forced to convert by the sword to Christianity, 1/3 murdered, and 1/3 expelled. By the time of the founding of the United States, there was no place on earth where Jews lived for more than a few hundred years without being raped, expelled, forced to convert to another religion, or mass murdered. We should add to our list freedom from forced conversions, freedom from being raped, freedom from being mass murdered, freedom from expulsions. The first Jewish congregation in the United States was founded in Rhode Island. On August 18, 1790, President George Washington wrote to that synagogue, "The citizens of the United States have a right to applaud themselves for having given mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess a liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was an indulgence of one class of people, that another enjoyed the exercise of inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they live under its protection, should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character to not avow I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit the joy and goodwill of other inhabitants, while every shall sit safety under their own vine and fig tree. There shall be none to make them afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and may we all live in several vocations useful here, and each his own due in time and happily everlasting." Thomas Jefferson wrote in his autobiography on February 6, 1821. He reflected on the attempt to create a bill establishing religious freedom formally in the United States. There were those who wanted to insert the words, so it should read, "A departure from this plan of Jesus Christ, the holy author of our religion." That insertion was rejected by a great majority in proof that they meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, which is how they referred to Muslims back then, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination. He wrote in the language of his times. Despite this, prejudice remained. Jews were excluded from jobs, elected office, housing, and well into the present time. I've experienced some of that myself. In Europe, in the early years of the United States, the French Revolution put Napoleon Bonaparte into high office as the Emperor of France. He did something radical regarding Jews. He posed the question to Jewish scholars. Were they French Jews or Jewish Frenchmen? That subtle difference was enormous. In every European state at that time, Jews were considered perpetual foreigners and had no rights of citizenship, and in many places were confined behind ghetto walls. The answer came back, we are Frenchmen who are Jewish. Napoleon proclaimed, all Frenchmen are French citizens, whether they be Jew or Christian. Within 20 years, Germany did the same, and across much of Europe, more than 1,000 years of ghetto walls started coming down. Freedom from ghettoization, freedom from never being able to become a citizen without denying one's own faith. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish Frenchman, was falsely convicted of espionage against France, largely based on anti-Jewish prejudices, which would fuel the beginning of the French anti-Semite party, a political party which was explicitly and exclusively anti-Jewish. Years later, Captain Dreyfus was exonerated, freed from Devil's Island prison colony, and his rank restored. This is where the term anti-Semitism arose. Until others in the past 20 years have co-opted the term to erase Jewish suffering from prejudices, it was universally understood to pertain only to Jews. Freedom from historical erasure, freedom from anti-Semitism. In response to anti-Semitism of the Dreyfus trial, a journalist named Theodor Herzl created the concept of Zionism, which at its most basic meaning was the right of Jews to return to our ancestral land. The early Zionists purchased land from Arabs who mostly came in with the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, it became Transjordan. It was also at that time it became known as British Mandate Palestine. Because of it being territory occupied by Great Britain, from the time of Roman conquest in 135 until the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, there was no independent Palestine. Any references to that name were geographical by occupying empires. The original vision of Zionism was coexistence between Jews and non-Jews, with Jews having self-determination and self-sufficiency in our own land. Tsarist Russia was particularly brutal to Jews, with frequent pogroms, rape, and murder and expulsions. Tsar Alexander was extremely cruel in conscripting Jewish boys at age 10 for 20 years, a length of time that they would not likely survive, and if they did, they would be unlikely to remember anything about their religion or culture. We need freedom from forced assimilation. It is no wonder that so many Jews supported the communist revolution. Its leaders, when empowered, were no less brutal than the czars. One Jew who participated in the revolution and left Russia just as Stalin rose to power wrote in response to a friend in the 1930s who asked why he chose to stay in the United States rather than to return to Russia. His name was Chaim Greenberg, and he said this: "For 20 years you've been conducting a system of physical and moral terror for the sake of human happiness. You've been employing the unholy to achieve the holy. Is it really so hard to understand that darkness is not the road to light, and that dictatorship and paternalism are not paths to freedom and independence, and that terror is no express train to a new golden age? Ends and means in politics are analogous to form and content in art. Form in art is not merely technique. Means in politics not merely instruments. The content must be felt in the form. The means must contain the basic elements of the end. When this minimal harmony between ends and means is lacking, we get the stake at which the Holy Inquisition burns unbelievers to save their souls." My lineal ancestors came to this country in my grandparents' generation. At least one of them got off the boat only to be conscripted into the Union Army during the Civil War. Some fled Germany when Jewish religious orthodoxy was able to co-opt the German government to close Reform's Jewish synagogues by spreading the fear that reforms in Judaism might spread, causing reforms in German Christianity. Freedom from fears of religious reformation. As we move forward in time into the 20th century, in the United States, Leo Frank, a Jew, was lynched on a false accusation, which was believed largely because he was a Jew. The Ku Klux Klan marched on Washington, D.C. And to be sure, their message were as anti-Semitic as they were anti-black. Influenced by the Dreyfus trial and the beginnings of Zionism, Edmund Flagg in the 1920s wrote this poem. I am a Jew because my faith demands of me no abdication of the mind. I am a Jew because my faith requires of me all the devotion of my heart. I am a Jew because in every place where suffering weeps, I weep. I am a Jew because at every time when despair cries out, I hope. I am a Jew because the word of the people Israel is the oldest and the newest. I am a Jew because the promise of the people of Israel is the universal promise. I am a Jew because for Israel the world is not completed, we are completing it. I am a Jew because for Israel humanity is not created, we are creating it. I am a Jew because for Israel places humanity in its unity above the nations and Israel itself. I am a Jew because above humanity, an image of divine unity, Israel places the unity which is divine. We can have unity without lockstep uniformity. Freedom to be diverse. Jews were involved in helping to organize and establish the NAACP. In fact, to this day, there is a seat reserved for a Jewish board member to the national office of the NAACP. Jews were also involved in organizing and establishing the United Farm Workers Union, as well as other various labor organizations. The B'nai B'rith was the beginnings of the Anti-Defamation League, the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. Meanwhile, in Europe in the 1930s, Germany, under economic collapse, went from one of the most liberal democracies to one of the worst authoritarian fascist states under the Nazis, where 1/3 of Jews were reduced to ashes, hence the name Holocaust, which literally means to be burned. Freedom from another Holocaust. In 1921 and 1924, the United States passed a series of laws to profoundly limit Jews from Eastern Europe from immigrating. Some of the oral history from my family in the 1930s, my great-grandfather's cousin wanted to come to the United States. In order to do that, my grandfather had to vouch that his cousin Albert would seek work in their jewelry store in Ohio. And that job was not created for Albert, and it was not taking a job away from another American. Albert's papers were approved, but he didn't end up working at his cousin's jewelry store. He went to Princeton to teach instead. The cousins shared the same last name, Einstein. As far as the anti-Semitic bureaucracy of the United States cared, he was just another Jew and had to deal with the barriers that existed at that time. The Holocaust could not have happened were it not for the fact that every country in the world, including the United States, made it nearly impossible to escape Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. This is called the abandonment of the Jews. Freedom from the closing of borders to refugees. All of my relatives who did not escape Eastern Europe by 1939 perished at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators, due in part to the closing of borders. Freedom for refugees to find safe harbor. When one tallies the documented evidence of the murder of Jews across history since the Exodus, half of all the Jews who have ever lived have been murdered by non-Jews, and 1/3 of that number in my parents' lifetime. On October 27, 2018, a man entered the Tree of Life Synagogue complex in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania during a Sabbath service, where he murdered in cold blood 12 members of that community. Their offense in his eyes was that they were supporting HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, a nearly 130-year-old aid organization, which was now helping to resettle Muslim refugees from Iraq and Syria in the United States. The names of the victims of this atrocity are memorialized in the first row of chairs at our local synagogue's large sanctuary. Many in our community continue to support HIAS to this day. Every Jew lives with the reality that we may be attacked as a surrogate by anyone with a grievance, real or imagined, against Jews or Israel, as well as our historically being staunch advocates for liberal Western democracy and human and civil rights. I'm a visible Jew. I could do things to pass or blend in. I choose not to. That would be surrendering to the bigots and haters. I've been verbally and physically accosted for being a Jew. I've been denied employment and housing for being a Jew. I've had my life threatened in this city for being a Jew. I've been approached by more people with curiosity than contempt for being a Jew. I try to keep that perspective in balance. Freedom to be our genuine selves, freedom to not have to pass for something we are not. The mirror opposite of freedom is enslavement. I will close my section with some of the selections from my family observance of Passover, which my family composed. The freedoms that we strive for are more than broken chains. It means the liberation of all of those enslavements that warp the spirit and blight the mind, that destroy the soul even though they leave the flesh alive. People can be enslaved in many ways. People can be enslaved to themselves when we let emotion sway us to our hurt. When we permit harmful habits to govern us, we are slaves. When laziness or cowardice keeps us from doing what we know to be right and correct, when ignorance binds us so that, like Samson, we can only turn around and around in meaningless drudgery, we are slaves. When envy and bitterness and jealousy sour our joys and darken the brightness of our contentment, we are slaves to ourselves, shackled by the chains of our own forging. People can be enslaved by poverty and inequality. When the fear of need drives anyone to dishonesty or violence, to defending the guilty, accusing the innocent, we are slaves. When the work people do enriches others but leaves them in want of decent, affordable housing, without nourishing food and warm clothes or medical care for their children, they are slaves. When we lack empathy for those in those situations, we too are slaves. We can be enslaved by intolerance. When Jews are forced to give up our Jewish way of life, abandon our teachings, to neglect our sacred festivals, we are slaves. When we must deny we are Jews in order to get work, we are slaves. When we must live in constant fear of unwarranted hatred and prejudice, we are slaves. When Israel is at war for generations, keeping her neighbors under military occupation, when even some, if not all, of her Jewish citizens preach hate and intolerance, we are slaves. When we are put more resources into making war rather than addressing the underlying causes of war, we are slaves. How deeply these enslavements have scarred the world. The wars, the destruction, the suffering, the waste. We are called to be free. Freedom from the tyranny of our own selves. Freedom from the enslavement of poverty and inequality. Freedom from the corroding hate that eats away the ties that should unite humanity. We are called to put an end to all slavery. We cry out in the name of God, let my people go. We are summoned to freedom. It is a sacred task. We must be fearless in supporting liberal democracy so that all may enjoy the freedoms it represents. This is part of doing tikkun olam, repairing a broken world. Freedom to repair a broken world. Freedom is waging peace by addressing the causes of war and repairing them. For sake of freedom and democracy, we must wage peace with greater vigor and strength than which has been put into waging war. Shalom, salam, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Does anyone have a question? All right. Yes, we have a question here.
How do we answer those who are being critical of the Biden administration because of the
The question is, how do we answer those who are being critical of the Biden administration because of the policies of Netanyahu? I can only tell you how I would answer. My answer is that this is not a one-sided conflict. My answer is, if people think all of a sudden shutting off all aid to Israel is going to miraculously stop the Israelis from pursuing what they see as an existential threat in terms of Hamas or Hezbollah, you're living in a fantasy world and you don't understand the strength of the Israeli military industrial complex, let alone the U.S. industrial military complex. Criticize freely, policies you disagree with, whether it's Netanyahu or Biden. I criticize the United States policies on many different things much of the time. That doesn't make me disloyal as a U.S. citizen. I have opposed the Likud government from its very beginnings and opposed Netanyahu. That doesn't make me a disloyal Jew. When you have somebody you care about or something you care about and it's doing things that are self-destructive, sometimes the greatest act of love is to say, no, I'm not going to be codependent. And I'm not going to be co-opted into cheering you on into doing things that I think are wrong. But the reality is the only way this is going to get settled is when Israelis and Palestinians decide that they'd rather live together than keep dying together. It's really on them to figure this out. Thank you.
What's the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah?
The question is, what is the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah? Hamas is an organization that is in Gaza, that was elected to government in 2006 and has refused to hold elections ever since. It has carried out terrorist attacks, not only in Israel, but among Palestinians to try to prevent an opposing party, Fatah, which is the party that controls the West Bank, from ever getting a foothold. So it's a Palestinian organization. Hezbollah is a proxy organization for Iran that is based in Lebanon and is being supplied in Iran, in Lebanon, to attack Israel from the north. Look, I think waging war is a nasty thing, and here's the thing. Everybody who you want to call a villain is a hero in their own story. So I'm going to limit what I say about either Hezbollah or Hamas. Okay? Is there any other questions? Okay, I'd like to share a song of hope. And this song says, peace will surely come to us, to everyone, and for the entire world. It's in Hebrew and Arabic. And you may see my shirt, my dyslexic shirt that's about 50 years, a little under 50 years old, where shalom is misspelled as shalom. That's what happens when you have a non-Jewish printer make a shirt with Hebrew. Od yavo shalom aleinu, Od yavo shalom aleinu, Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Od yavo shalom aleinu, Od yavo shalom aleinu, Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam aleinu ve'akol ha'olam, olam, salam, salam aleinu ve'akol ha'olam, salam, salam. May it be soon in our days.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was wonderful. Now, we're going to close off in a minute with comedian Ron Howard. First, I want to let everybody know there's a couple of pieces of artwork on display over on the bench that we're raffling off. Before you leave, please have a look at them. Consider buying a ticket. And I hope everybody leaves today with an understanding of what brought us together. Freedom takes on as many forms, as many voices as there are people in this world, because no matter what agendas we follow, no matter what divides us, no matter what we think the other person is, the desire to be free and to stay free is fundamentally human. So With that, now, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, our last performer comes from Riverton. He wears a lot of hats, including father, husband, veteran, teacher, actor, activist, and comedian. Today, he's here to do his best to make you laugh. Please put your hands together for Mr. Ron Howard.
Hello, how is everybody? I actually wrote that introduction, and when I was hearing it, I felt a little bit guilty. I was like, man, am I really that cool? So, let me come out here a little bit so you guys could see me. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to start off with something in Arapaho. I'm going to say haba, dos, ha-ho. Haba is hello to all the men. Dos is hello to all the women, and ha-ho is thank you. So, if I say haba, the men say back to me, haba. Okay, now let's try it with the women. I'm going to say dos, and you say it back to me. So, to the women, dos. Dos, very good. And ha-ho is thank you. So, if you can't tell, I'm Native American. I don't always wear stuff like this, but when we natives leave the reservation, we have to dress like this, so we're not hassled by immigration. I was watching Fox News not too long ago, and there was a politician on there who made the claim that illegal aliens and terrorists could filter into the reservation and then blend in with the indigenous population. And I thought that's kind of a stretch. And then last year, I went to the powwow, and I was hanging out there, and there was a guy there in full regalia, feathers. He was going out there dancing. I got to talking to him. He was a really cool guy. And I finally said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is Almud Muhammad Stands with a Bomb." So, touche, politician. So there are some things about being on the reservation that sets us apart from the rest of the world. One of them is Kamad cheese. Government cheese. We use that as currency where I live. That's how we pay our babysitters, is a big block of government cheese. We used to trade in horses and women. Now it's cheese. Some of us, we're not beyond going to Walmart to get our senior pictures taken. That's another reservation thing you might come across. Another one is a word that we like to say. It's ene. Have you guys ever heard of that? Ene. It's how we end a sentence. Hey, that was a really good speech, isn't it? So it's sort of a contraction of, isn't it? Scottish people have the same thing, they say anta. So we say inna. So anyway, moving on. Those are just a few things about living on the reservation. I have a cheat sheet here just mentioning everything I want to talk about so I don't get lost. There's a thing that goes around. People give me a lot of crap about how I speak. Because I'm Native American, I don't sound Native American. And there's a reason I speak the way I do. It's because when I was a little kid, I had a lot of speech problems. And this was back in the days when I didn't know there was such a thing as speech therapy. So what I did was I got a tape recorder for Christmas one year. And every Saturday, I would record a radio show called American Top 40 with Casey Kasem. You guys remember that? Yeah, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So what I would do is I would record that and I would play it back and then I would repeat what Casey Kasem said. And in a matter of months, I pretty much got rid of my speech problems, but I still continue to do public speaking, stand-up comedy, and acting and all that stuff, just to sort of maintain that. Because if I don't, I sort of regress a little bit. So I tell you that to get into this next part. Over the years, a lot of Native women have asked me, "Are you gay?" And at first, I thought it was funny. And then it happened several other times. And I always tried to prove to these Native women that I wasn't, but I never had any takers. But I asked, "Why do you think I'm gay?" And they all said the same thing. "It's because you talk like a white man." So, Any of you white guys here, if you go to the reservation with the intent of scoring with a native woman, she's likely to think you're bi-curious. Forewarned. So, on that same note, a few years ago, there's a woman in Lander, her name is Sarah Wiles. She's an author. I don't know if you guys have heard of her or not. She wrote 2 big, huge coffee table books about Arapaho people. And I had the privilege of being in both of those. And so I went to a book signing, and she asked me if I would come up and introduce her. So I did. I got up, and it was a pretty generic introduction. I said, "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here." Something like, it's good to see natives and non-natives coming together for a common cause. And so I gave the little speech, I introduced her, she gave her thing, and then I came up and I spoke about my part of the book. And then afterwards, after it was all over, this little old lady comes up and she's shaking my hand, she's looking up to me, and she keeps saying, "What a wonderful speech that was." And, "Oh, thank you very much, ma'am, I appreciate that." And she said, "Well, there's something I want to tell you, but I don't know if I should or not." And I said, well, she seemed like a very nice elderly lady. And I said, "Go ahead and tell me what's on your mind." So she's sitting here shaking my hand, and she said, "Well, you're the most articulate Indian I've ever encountered." And so I was thinking to myself, I said you weren't going to be insulting, but that was pretty damn insulting. So as I'm shaking her hand and saying, "Thank you, aho," I start squeezing just a little bit harder, but I couldn't help it. Anyway, it's that kind of sort of subtle racism that a lot of us have to deal with on the reservation. I don't think people mean to be that way. Some people are outright about it, but on the reservation, most people are trying to be nice about telling me how smart I am in spite of what I am. So I don't know if I should laugh about that. I try to. Let's see, moving on here. Another thing about being on the reservation, the cars we drive, they're called res runners or res racers, which I'm very proud to say that my very first car was a res runner. It was a 1963 Dodge son of a bitch. Went from 0 to 60 whenever it wanted to. Sometimes when I wasn't even in the car, it would just start up and start chasing cows through the pasture. Had to get rid of it though. I sold it after 600,000 miles and got the cheaper version of the Dodge son of a bitch. It was a 1973 Plymouth Bastard. So, if you come to the reservation, that's another sight to behold. Any reality TV fans? Anybody? Reality TV? No, I'm with you. We got one. We got one. I'm not a big fan of reality TV. I think my least favorite show is Survivor. And what they do is, if you're not familiar, they get a whole bunch of pricks and bitches, and they put them on an island, and they make them sort of stab each other in the back, and then they vote somebody off. They're not very nice to each other. But they're starting to run out of locations, I think, because next season they're doing a show called Survivor Reservation. And what they're going to do is they're going to take the same pricks and bitches and put them together, and one native guy, and he's going to be cool like me. He's going to teach them everything that they need to know: how to hunt, how to fish, how to build a shelter, how to make wine with government raisins, you name it. And once they've learned all that, what are they going to do? They're going to vote him off, is what they're going to do. What kind of self-respecting native gets kicked off his own reservation anyway, right? So, there's something I would like to mention here, and this is actually true. I have a diagnosed depressive disorder, and it's okay though, because I take medication for it. But every once in a while, I kind of get into a rut. Last Christmas vacation, I was feeling really depressed. So I told my wife, I said, "I got to go for a drive." She said, "Okay." So I started driving out of Riverton. Pretty soon I was in Lander. I just kept driving. Pretty soon I was in Rawlins. Pretty soon I was on the interstate. Next thing I knew, I was in some town in eastern Nebraska, just off the interstate, in a motel room. snowing to beat hell. Snow's drifted up over my car, and I'm feeling so down and depressed. I'm in this dingy motel room that smells like cigarettes and beer. There's a big brown stain on the carpet. It's probably blood. There's only 2 stations. There's like PBS and the 700 Club. And so I sit down on the bed thinking, what am I going to do? Am I going to call my wife and tell her I'm somewhere in eastern Nebraska? She's probably going to divorce me. So I sat down on the bed and I opened up the nightstand, and there it was, the Gideon's Bible. In every single motel room and hotel room in the country, for the first time in my life, I opened it up, looking for something that was going to make me feel better. So I opened it up, I'm flipping through the pages, I get to the book of Matthew, and there's, not in the Bible, but there's a handwritten note. So I pulled it out and I looked at it, and it said, are you at the end of your rope and you have no way out? If so, call this number. So I called the number, somebody answered, and I was saved. Turns out it was a liquor store that delivered. So, yeah, lucky me. So as an actor, I get to audition once in a while for different things, and here we live in this, what they call a woke nation. I auditioned a little while ago, a couple days ago, and I actually got cast in a country and western musical comedy variety show for transsexuals. It's called Her Ha. Have you heard of it? Uh-oh. Jason's over here shaking his head. I got one for you, Jason, here in a minute. You're going to love this one. So, we were talking about, some of you guys had mentioned running for office. And I've thought about it. I've entertained the notion of running for tribal council. I always said that if I run for tribal council, I'm going to build a wall around E-City and make the Shoshone tribe pay for it. So, I told my dad that one time, and he said, you know, for as many people as you piss off, Ron, if you ran for tribal council and won, you would likely be the first council member to ever be assassinated. So, I'm still thinking about it. I've actually had people threaten me physically for some of the jokes that I've told. I told one joke that somebody threatened to kill me. You want to hear it? Okay. What's the difference between a chickpea and a lima bean? Trump never had a lima bean on his face. Thank you. Thank you. So, okay, this one's for Dr. Bloomberg here. I was driving out to the powwow earlier this summer. And, well, I should go back a little bit. My wife is not native. She is of origin descent. There she is right there. My beautiful wife, Amy, and her beautiful sister, Marisa. And there's my beautiful daughter, Elizabeth, who is half Arapaho, half Norwegian. So, which means she doesn't know whether or not she sunburns or not. So there's a lot of sort of interracial sort of marriages. So, you know, I'm married to a Norwegian woman, and there's a lot of people marrying other races. And so I was on my way to the powwow, and on the side of the road, there was a guy that turns out he was half Arapaho and half Jewish, which I'd never encountered anybody like that before. And so he's standing there, his car broke down, and I pulled over to see if he needed any help. I got out, and here he is. He's in full regalia. He's kicking his tires, and he says, "Can you believe this? Can you believe this? I paid $12 for these retreads, and the damn things didn't last me 6 months. Here I am in the middle of the highway on my way to powwow. I got a back seat full of kosher taco meat and fry bagels going bad. I think I got the crabs from that casino down the road. And to top it all off, these octopus in my moccasins are killing me. Oy vey! Isn't it?" There we go. That one's for you. Thank you very much. So there was another joke that I wanted to tell before I close up here. This is one that you guys can take home with you if you like. Yeah, okay. So, Ted Bundy, everybody remembers Ted Bundy? Him and his girlfriend were walking down this nature trail one day. It's out in the country. They walk into the forest, and the further in they get, the thicker the trees get. The sun's going down. It's starting to get dark. They're holding hands, and his girlfriend says, "Ted, it's getting dark out here, and I'm getting really scared." And Ted Bundy says, "You're scared? How do you think I feel? I gotta walk out of here by myself." Oh. All right, well, that's it for me, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose I'll take a question, but please don't ask me to make any punchlines better, because I don't know how. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, everybody. That's it for this year's Fall Freedom Festival. I hope we can do it again next year. Please drive safe on the way home and stay free.
You got 40.
I got 20 in cash. What's that? Oh.
Thank you. It's been recorded.